I need to tell you about something that happened on March 14th, 1973, at precisely 3:15 in the afternoon at Golden Harvest Studios in Kowloon Tong, Hong Kong. Only 6 people witnessed what I'm about to describe, and for 51 years, every single one of us who stood in that soundstage kept our silence. Not because anyone ordered us to remain quiet, not because we signed non-disclosure agreements or swore oaths on sacred texts, but because what we saw that afternoon changed our understanding of human capability so profoundly that ordinary words felt inadequate to capture the truth of it. We tried, in the weeks and months that followed, to explain to friends and colleagues what we'd witnessed, but the descriptions came out sounding like exaggeration or fantasy, like the kind of tall tales that get embellished with each retelling until they lose all connection to reality. So we stopped trying. We held the memory privately, examining it in quiet moments, turning it over in our minds like a gemstone whose facets revealed new light depending on the angle of observation. Bruce Lee died on July 20th, 1973, just 4 months after the incident I'm about to describe. He was 32 years old. With his death, the urgency to share this story publicly seemed to evaporate. Who would believe us anyway? The man was gone, transformed into legend and myth, and adding another impossible story to the collection felt somehow disrespectful, like we'd be contributing to the carnival of exaggeration that already surrounded his memory. So we remained silent, attending the funeral, grieving privately, moving forward with our lives and careers while carrying this secret knowledge like a weight we'd chosen to bear. But I'm 78 years old now, and the mathematics of mortality have become impossible to ignore. Of the 6 witnesses that afternoon, 3 have already passed into whatever comes next. Time is not our ally. And I've come to understand that some stories deserve to outlive those who lived them, that there are truths worth preserving even if their preservation risks skepticism or dismissal. What happened in 3 seconds on a soundstage floor in Kowloon Tong taught me more about mastery, restraint, and the nature of true skill than everything I learned in my 40-year career as a fight choreographer for films across 3 continents. The lesson contained in those 3 seconds has influenced every decision I've made since, every technique I've taught, every fight sequence I've designed. That's worth something. That's worth the risk of being called a liar or a fantasist. This is what I saw, what 6 of us saw, when Jack Sullivan, Hollywood stuntman and former collegiate wrestler who stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 225 pounds, told Bruce Lee that anyone with decent athletic ability could do what he does, that it wasn't that impressive, that it was all choreography and camera tricks, that a real fighter would walk right through those fancy kicks and end the whole thing in seconds. This is what happened next. The soundstage occupied 12,000 square feet of cavernous industrial space, its ceiling rising 35 feet above polished concrete floors that had been buffed smooth by decades of foot traffic and equipment wheels. The concrete itself displayed that particular gray quality that comes from countless coats of industrial sealant, catching and reflecting the banks of tungsten lights suspended from motorized rigs that hung like mechanical spiders from the ceiling's steel gridwork. These lights, each unit generating enough heat to warm a small room, had been running since 7 that morning, and the accumulated thermal load had raised the internal temperature to somewhere around 85 degrees despite the industrial air handlers laboring at full capacity. The sound of those handlers created a constant, low-frequency hum, background noise that everyone on set had learned to ignore but that microphones picked up relentlessly, forcing sound mixers to filter it in post-production. In the corners of the soundstage, shadows pooled thick and black, where the carefully positioned illumination couldn't penetrate. These dark spaces accumulated the detritus of production, coils of electrical cable that would be needed later, wooden apple boxes that served as impromptu seating, discarded coffee cups, and the personal belongings of crew members who'd been working 12-hour days for the past 3 weeks. The eastern wall held stacks of backdrop flats, painted plywood panels depicting everything from ancient Chinese temples to modern Hong Kong streets, leaning at careful angles to prevent warping. Some of these flats still smelled of fresh paint, the chemical tang cutting through the more dominant odors that filled the space. And those smells, they created an olfactory signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. The sawdust from temporary set construction, where carpenters had been building the underground lair's wooden framework that morning. Their table saws producing fine powder that hung in the air and settled on every horizontal surface. The electrical ozone generated by the lighting equipment, that sharp metallic scent that registered somewhere between taste and smell, coating the back of your throat after hours of exposure. The sweat of physical labor and tropical humidity, dozens of crew members moving heavy equipment, adjusting set pieces, carrying props and costumes. The leather smell from the stunt pads and protective equipment stored in the southwestern corner. The faint petroleum odor from the hydraulic lifts that moved camera platforms. And underlying everything, the musty concrete smell of the building itself, which had been constructed in 1958 and carried 15 years of accumulated moisture in its walls despite being located in one of Hong Kong's driest industrial zones. It was 3:15 in the afternoon, and the production had broken for 15 minutes while the lighting crew, 4 technicians led by a gruff Taiwanese master electrician named Chen, adjusted the key light positioning for the underground lair sequence, scheduled to begin filming at 4 o'clock sharp. Director Robert Klaus, an American imported specifically for this production because Golden Harvest believed Western directors could better communicate with Western distributors, wanted dramatic shadows for this sequence, the kind of film noir contrast that would make Bruce Lee's movements pop against the darkness. Chen was explaining in Cantonese punctuated with frustrated English why the requested lighting setup would create impossible exposure problems for the film stock they were using. The cinematographer, a Hong Kong veteran named Gilbert Hubbs, who'd shot everything from Shaw Brothers epics to low-budget action quickies, nodded along while making notes on a clipboard, clearly planning to ignore Chen's technical objections and achieve Klaus's vision through some combination of additional equipment and post-production color timing. This was the environment into which the confrontation erupted. This was the physical and social space that would contain 3 seconds of action that would reshape everyone's understanding of what human bodies could accomplish when trained to absolute efficiency. The industrial setting, the creative tension between director and crew, the heat and smell and constant background noise, all of it created a context that made what happened seem even more surreal, like watching a documentary suddenly transform into mythology before your eyes. Bruce Lee stood near the center of this industrial cathedral, positioned in the pool of white light where the key and fill lights intersected with mathematical precision. He was dressed in simple black cotton pants, the kind you could buy in any Hong Kong market for $30, and a sleeveless white undershirt that had yellowed slightly from repeated washing. His feet were bare against the concrete, and if you watched carefully, you could see him occasionally rotating his ankles, keeping the joints mobile, preventing stiffness from setting in during the production break. At 5 feet 7 inches and 135 pounds, his frame appeared almost delicate in the vast industrial space, a scale problem that the eye struggled to resolve. How could someone so compact occupy such presence? How could someone who weighed less than most of the equipment cases command such attention? But anyone who actually observed him, who truly looked rather than merely glanced in his direction, noticed immediately that this was no ordinary physique. His latissimus dorsi muscles flared from his spine to his armpits with a width that seemed impossible for his skeletal frame, creating that distinctive V-taper that bodybuilders spent years trying to develop. His waist measured 26 inches, smaller than many women's, creating a contrast ratio with his shoulders that approached the mathematical golden ratio that classical sculptors had sought. His forearms, exposed by the sleeveless shirt, displayed striations visible from 20 feet away, each muscle bundle distinct under skin that seemed thin enough to be translucent. You could literally count the muscle fibers, see them bunch and relax as his hands moved through demonstration gestures. When he moved, even in these casual between-take moments, the quality of motion arrested attention. There was no wasted energy, no extraneous flourish, no unnecessary tension. Shifting weight from one foot to another, he demonstrated the same economic efficiency that made his fighting look superhuman on film. The movement flowed from center of mass outward, each joint contributing its precise amount of force and rotation, the whole body operating as an integrated system rather than collection of parts. Turning to address someone behind him, his spine rotated with the fluid quality of a ball bearing, smooth and controlled through the entire range of motion. Reaching for a water bottle 15 feet away, his arm extended in a straight line, no wavering or overcorrection, fingers closing on the plastic container with exactly enough pressure to grip without crushing. And his presence, the ineffable quality that cameras captured, but that defied analytical description, it filled the space around him like an electromagnetic field. People oriented toward him unconsciously, the way plants turn toward sunlight. Conversations nearby dropped in volume without anyone deciding to speak more quietly. Movement in his vicinity became more careful, more considered, as if his refined precision somehow demanded similar refinement from those sharing his space. This wasn't intimidation exactly. Bruce Lee smiled easily, engaged warmly with everyone from the lowest production assistant to the executive producers. But there was an intensity to his focus, a quality of complete presence in each moment that made casual interaction feel weighted with significance. He stood now explaining a technique to Wong In-sik, the Korean Hapkido master who'd been brought in to choreograph some of the ground fighting sequences, because Bruce Lee, despite his comprehensive knowledge, recognized that specialists brought depth to specific domains. The two men spoke in a hybrid language, Cantonese mixed with English and occasional Korean, their hands moving through slow-motion versions of throws and joint locks. Wong would demonstrate a traditional Hapkido technique, and Bruce Lee would examine it from every angle, testing the leverage points, feeling where force concentrated, identifying the moments where timing mattered more than strength. Then he'd show Wong how the same principle could be expressed more efficiently, eliminating 2 setup steps to go directly to the controlling position, or shifting the angle 3 degrees to make the lock inescapable rather than merely painful. Around them, the larger crew continued with break-time routines. Grips smoked cigarettes near the loading dock. The big steel door rolled open to let in humid March air. Camera assistants cleaned lenses with special cloths, treating the expensive optics with reverent care. The director, Robert Klaus, reviewed Polaroid continuity photos at a folding table, making notes on a yellow legal pad. Around this central demonstration, the larger ecosystem of production continued with the organized chaos that defines film sets worldwide. Grips smoked cigarettes near the loading dock. The big steel door rolled open to admit humid March air that did nothing to cool the space, but at least provided circulation. They talked about the Lakers game they'd watched on Armed Forces television the night before, about the new girlfriend that one of them had met at a Wan Chai bar, about whether the production would finish on schedule or run over into April. Camera assistants cleaned lenses with special cloths and canned air, treating the expensive German optics with reverent care, their fingers developing that particular delicate strength that comes from handling fragile precision equipment for years. Robert Klaus reviewed Polaroid continuity photos at a folding table someone had set up near the craft services station, making notes on a yellow legal pad about costume consistency and prop placement. His director's obsession with detail expressing itself in minutiae that audiences would never consciously notice, but that their subconscious would register if wrong. And in the southwestern corner of the soundstage, gathered in a loose cluster near their equipment bags and street clothes, the Western stunt team occupied their own territory. 7 men ranging from 190 to 230 pounds, all with backgrounds in American football, boxing, wrestling, or some combination of contact sports that left them comfortable with violence and confident in their physical capabilities. They'd been flown in specifically for Enter the Dragon's underground tournament sequences because the producers, thinking commercially, wanted Caucasian fighters for Bruce Lee to defeat. International audiences, particularly American and European markets where the real money lived, needed to see Bruce Lee overcome opponents who looked like them, who represented their size and strength and fighting systems. The logic was crude but commercially sound, and these men understood their function in the narrative economy. They were here to lose impressively, to make Bruce Lee look good, to absorb kicks and punches and sell the impact for camera. It was honest work, and it paid better than most stunt gigs. They came from Hollywood's stunt community, that informal network of daredevils and athletes who'd found careers throwing themselves off buildings, crashing cars, fighting on camera, and occasionally dying in service of entertainment. Their reputations derived from accumulated damage and fearlessness. How many times had you been set on fire? How many car crashes had you walked away from? Could you do a 30-foot high fall into an airbag and sell the terror while maintaining precise body position for the camera? How convincingly could you absorb a punch and make it look devastating when in reality, the fist had stopped 2 inches from your face? These were the metrics that mattered, the currency of respect in their professional circle. Jack Sullivan stood at the center of this group, 6 feet 2 inches of weathered confidence and accumulated muscle mass. At 41 years old, he'd been working stunts for 15 years, ever since graduating from UCLA, where he'd wrestled at heavyweight, placing third in the Pac-8 conference his senior year with a record of 27 wins and 11 losses. That wrestling background had become his foundation, the base of knowledge upon which he'd built everything else. He understood leverage from thousands of hours on the mat. He knew how to distribute weight and maintain balance while another human being tried to take both away. He'd learned to keep moving when every muscle screamed for rest, to push through pain that would stop ordinary people, to view his body as a tool to be used and maintained, rather than cherished and protected. His face told the story of his profession, a map of accumulated damage that he wore with something approaching pride. The nose had been broken 3 times, twice in wrestling matches and once on the set of a Western when a punch that should have been pulled connected with full force because the other stuntman had been drinking and misjudged the distance. Each break had been reset imperfectly, either because Sullivan couldn't afford proper medical care or because he prioritized getting back to work over cosmetic correction. The result pointed slightly right and had a pronounced bump, 2/3 of the way down its bridge. Scar tissue around both eyebrows created a slightly hooded appearance, each scar representing a punch or elbow that had split skin and required stitches. The left ear displayed that telltale cauliflower quality that comes from repeated trauma to the cartilage, grappling injuries that had left the ear permanently swollen and misshapen. His jaw could have been carved from granite, square and pronounced, the kind of jaw that could absorb punishment and keep functioning. His hands, resting on his knees as he sat on a wooden equipment case, looked like they belonged to someone who worked construction rather than someone who performed choreographed violence. The knuckles were enlarged, each joint thickened by thousands of impacts against heavy bags, focus mitts, and occasionally other human beings. His fingers, which should have been long and elegant given his height, appeared stubby and thick, scarred across the backs where skin had split during wrestling matches or stunt work. The palms showed calluses built up over decades, ridge formations that came from gripping and holding and applying pressure until opponents submitted or rolls were completed. When he made a fist, the hands transformed into weapons, and Sullivan knew it, had relied on it throughout his career. He weighed 225 pounds, distributed across a frame that had been built through 20 years of serious weight training, protein-heavy diets, and chemical supplementation that he never discussed publicly, but that everyone in the stunt community understood as standard practice. His chest measured 48 inches around, thick with muscle developed through endless bench pressing and dip variations. His shoulders were broad enough that buying off-the-rack clothing was impossible. Everything had to be tailored or stretched to accommodate the width. His quadriceps, visible through the loose cotton pants he wore for stunt work, bulged with distinct muscle definition, each head of the muscle group clearly delineated. He could squat 400 pounds for repetitions, deadlift more than 500, and had been clocked in the 40-yard dash at 4.8 seconds. Impressive speed for someone his size. In Sullivan's understanding of physical conflict, size mattered above all else. Not size alone, obviously. He wasn't naive. But size combined with strength, with proper technique, with conditioning and experience, that combination determined outcomes in actual fighting. He'd seen it play out hundreds of times in wrestling matches, in street fights he'd witnessed or participated in during his younger years, in the occasional times when stunts went wrong and choreography became real violence. The bigger, stronger man who knew what he was doing beat the smaller, weaker man who knew what he was doing. That was physics. That was reality. All the technique in the world couldn't overcome a 90-pound weight disadvantage once the fight hit the ground and weight could be applied directly. This worldview wasn't just professional opinion. It represented his lived experience, the accumulated wisdom of 2 decades using his body as his livelihood. He'd studied boxing from a former Golden Gloves champion who'd taught him to use his jab to control distance and set up power punches. He trained judo for 3 years in the early 60s when it had briefly become fashionable in Los Angeles, earning his brown belt before losing interest and returning to wrestling. He'd picked up bits and pieces of karate, enough to throw basic kicks, though he found them impractical for actual fighting, too slow and too easy to counter with a good tackle or clinch. His fighting philosophy, insofar as he'd articulated one, emphasized control through superior positioning, overwhelming opponents with size and strength, and maintaining pressure until they broke physically or psychologically. And from this perspective, from this accumulated foundation of knowledge and experience, Bruce Lee's martial arts looked like sophisticated performance rather than practical fighting system. Sure, the kicks were impressive, the speed was remarkable, the flexibility and control demonstrated genuine athleticism, but it was choreography, optimized for camera, designed to look devastating rather than to be devastating. The high kicks that looked so spectacular on film would get you taken down and pounded in a real fight, Sullivan believed. The fancy hand-trapping stuff worked great when your opponent cooperated, but a committed wrestler would blast through that distance and establish a clinch before the hands could do their thing. And once the fight hit the ground, where wrestling and size advantages fully expressed themselves, what good were kicks and hand speed? Sullivan had watched Bruce Lee work for 3 weeks now, observed the training sessions and technique demonstrations, and his assessment had only solidified. Impressive, yes. Legitimate dangerous fighter, he wasn't convinced. The other stuntmen seemed awed, treated Bruce Lee with an almost reverential respect that Sullivan found excessive. Sure, show proper deference to the star, acknowledge his skills, but don't act like the guy was superhuman. He was 5'7" and 135. Sullivan had literally wrestled women who weighed more and could probably take him down given the right circumstances. This wasn't disrespect in Sullivan's mind. It was honesty, the kind of straight talk that his professional world valued. Don't let mystique and legend cloud your judgment about actual capability. This assessment, this conviction that size and strength ultimately determined outcomes, and that Bruce Lee's martial arts were more performance than practical, had been building in Sullivan over the 3 weeks of production. He'd mentioned it to a few of the other stuntmen, who'd offered non-committal responses that suggested they either disagreed or didn't want to voice agreement publicly. He'd kept his thoughts mostly private, not from fear but from professional courtesy. The man was the star, the reason they all had jobs on this production, and openly challenging his legitimacy seemed ungrateful and counterproductive. But watching Bruce Lee now demonstrating that Hapkido technique to Wong, talking about balance points and leverage and efficiency, something in Sullivan snapped. Maybe it was the heat, the oppressive warmth of the soundstage making everyone irritable. Maybe it was fatigue from 3 weeks of long days and physical demands. Maybe it was the way everyone else seemed to treat Bruce Lee's words as gospel truth, never questioning or pushing back, just accepting and absorbing like students who'd forgotten to think critically. Whatever the trigger, Sullivan felt compelled to speak the truth as he understood it, to voice what he believed everyone was thinking but was too polite or intimidated to say out loud. He stood up from the equipment case, stretching to his full height, rolling his shoulders to work out stiffness from sitting. His voice, when he spoke, carried easily across the soundstage, despite not being particularly loud. Sullivan had learned voice projection from years of shouting over construction noise, coordinating stunts, and making himself heard in chaotic filming environments. The words cut through Chen's Cantonese complaints about lighting and the ambient background hum of the air handlers. What he said was this: Bruce Lee moved well for a little guy, no question. The kicks looked fantastic on camera. The hand speed was genuinely impressive. But when you got right down to it, when you stripped away the mystique and the legend and looked at actual fighting capability, anybody with decent athletic ability and a few months of focused training could do what he does. It wasn't that special. It wasn't superhuman. It was choreography, sophisticated and well-executed choreography, but choreography nonetheless. Fighting for camera was different from actual fighting. Everyone in the stunt business knew that. You made things look good, you hit your marks, you sold the impact for the audience. But that didn't mean the techniques would work against an uncooperative opponent who wasn't following the script. Sullivan paused, aware that he'd captured everyone's attention, but not yet fully processing the implications of that attention. He continued, building momentum, articulating thoughts he'd been refining privately for weeks. The high kicks looked spectacular, sure, but they were slow, telegraphed, and left you completely vulnerable to a takedown. Any competent wrestler would time that kick and shoot underneath it, get hold of both legs and slam the kicker into the ground before the foot had finished its arc. The hand trapping stuff, all that sticky hands and intercept theory, it worked great in demonstrations against compliant partners who attacked in predictable patterns. But a real fighter throwing committed combinations with serious bad intentions behind them, that hand trapping would get overwhelmed by sheer volume and power. And size, Sullivan said, warming to his theme now, genuinely believing he was offering educational reality check rather than profound insult. Size mattered more than people wanted to admit. Bruce Lee weighed 135 soaking wet. Sullivan weighed 90 pounds more. That wasn't a minor difference. That was a completely different weight class, the kind of discrepancy that nullified technique advantages. When two skilled fighters met, the bigger one won. When a skilled fighter met a smaller skilled fighter, physics decided the outcome before the first punch was thrown. You couldn't overcome 90 pounds with speed or technique or philosophy. You could make it look like you could on camera with editing and cooperation and choreography. But in actual fighting, reality asserted itself brutally and quickly. Sullivan concluded his analysis by saying that given Bruce Lee's size and build, any real fighter with actual power, someone like Sullivan himself, for instance, could walk right through those fancy kicks, close the distance, establish a clinch, and use wrestling control to end any confrontation within seconds. Maybe 10 seconds if Bruce Lee was really fast, but more likely 5. Once the fight hit the ground, once superior weight could be applied directly, the outcome was inevitable. This wasn't meant as disrespect, Sullivan added, aware on some level that his words might be taken wrongly. It was just honest assessment from someone who'd been in real fights, who'd felt what happened when size and strength met technique and speed. He was just saying what everyone else was thinking but was too polite to voice. The soundstage went quiet in that peculiar way where silence itself becomes an entity, a presence you can feel against your skin and pressing on your eardrums.